For years, Bangladeshi Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina seemed untouchable. The daughter of the country's first president, a man known as the father of Bangladesh, Hasina presided over the country for 15 consecutive years. During that time, she consolidated power, locking up opposition leaders, appointing loyalists to the courts, and maintaining an iron grip over the army and police. And then, suddenly, it was over. Earlier this month, she fled the country, forced from power by throngs of protesters, mostly young students, who flooded the streets demanding her ouster. It is telling that the trigger for the protests was not a rigged election or state violence, both of which have been attributed to Hasina's rule, but rather jobs, specifically the lack of them. Bangladeshis were demonstrating against a quota that would have set aside 30% of highly coveted public sector jobs for descendants of freedom fighters who helped win Bangladesh's independence from Pakistan in 1971. Critics claimed the quota was a gift to members of Hasina's Awami League, as many freedom fighters were tied to the party. What has played out in Bangladesh in recent weeks certainly reflects widespread disaffection with Hasina's rule, but it also has roots in a deep economic malaise in the country. It wasn't always this way. Bangladesh has previously been touted as one of the most inspiring economic success stories in the developing world. Its economy grew at an average of 6.6% per year in the decade preceding the pandemic. Its booming garment industry sent cheaply made clothing and textiles to companies like H&M and Zara and lifted millions of workers, many of them women, out of poverty. Its per capita GDP at one point surpassed India's, and its economy grew to be bigger than Denmark's. But Bangladesh's economic strength also had a hidden vulnerability: joblessness. As the New York Times notes, Bangladesh's leaders, including Hasina, doubled down on the country's garment sector, which accounts for more than 80% of exports. A single export economy made the country susceptible to global economic headwinds. In 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, demand for clothes went way down. As NPR reports, factories shuttered and more than 1 million workers lost their jobs. Eventually, demand recovered, only to face another setback: inflation. And Bangladesh faces other economic problems. Its scarcity of power infrastructure means it relies on imports to meet its energy needs. Like many developing countries, Bangladesh offers subsidies for fuel. But when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the cost of fuel shot up. Bangladesh raised prices for petrol, diesel, and kerosene by more than 50%, which led to a wave of unrest. Hasina may have calculated that as long as she delivered growth, her people would look away as she grew increasingly authoritarian. But protesters complained that the economic gains under Hasina's rule were concentrated in the hands of an already enriched political class. According to Chatham House, nearly 1/5 of young people are not engaged in work or education in Bangladesh. As the New York Times notes, more than 300,000 graduates compete for 4,000 government jobs each year, which explains the outrage over a policy that would result in so many of those good jobs being earmarked for special groups. The chaos in Bangladesh holds lessons for poor countries all over the world, where bulging youth populations and economic malaise lead easily to unrest. Neighboring India also struggles to provide jobs to its burgeoning youth population and has faced protests in the past because of it. But India and Bangladesh, despite their jobs crises, are still growing economies. Sub-Saharan Africa is facing an even worse problem: a jobs crisis with stagnant growth. The average per capita GDP there peaked in 2014 at $2,000 and has never recovered since. And like Bangladesh and India, that part of Africa has a large youth population. 70% of its citizens are under the age of 30. Kenya and Nigeria have both faced protests this summer over policies tied to their ailing economies. What Bangladesh shows all these countries is how easily progress without a broad foundation can be undone, how swiftly a nation can turn from an exemplar to a cautionary tale. Thanks to all of you for being part of my program this week. I will see you next week.